again. Welcome to Science Symposium 2019. It's my pleasure to present Neil Kendall. Neil lives here in suburban Chicago with his wife and 2 daughters. Throughout his 38-year professional career, he has held a wide variety of positions, generally in the capacity best described as technical marketing at several high-tech companies. Neil graduated with a history degree at Northern Illinois University, then gained a computer science degree at Roosevelt University, and picked up a bit of additional coursework toward a master's degree in computer science and bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. He enjoys reading about philosophy and current trends in science. I happily present you Neil.
Thank you, Ralph. That's the kindest thing anybody's ever said about me. Although I did write that, so I give you credit for it. Is free will an illusion? Anybody?
No.
The answer is no. We're done. Thank you.
Well done, well done.
Okay. What I hope to give you in this presentation is a way in conversation, whether professional or just around the dinner table, some ammunition to combat the scourge of materialism. And free will is one way to do that.
Try to stay on this side.
That might not be possible. Okay, so materialism is that we know materialism, physicalism, as Marjorie has reminded us that it's also called physicalism, is the dominant view in the intellectual, among intellectual elites today. This quote down here by William James, one of the great philosophers of America, maybe the greatest philosopher, really goes to the heart of what we all feel about the fact that we have free will. And without it, if we're told that it's an illusion, who knows what that's going to lead to. Science has adopted materialism as its first principle. I mentioned in the discussion here that there's a problem in epistemology that I've called an infinite regress, where you have to keep justifying your beliefs, and each belief has to be justified, and that has to be justified. And there's an infinite regress. Science, the success of science has led philosophers to adopt materialism as its first principle, its founding assumption. My opinion is materialism is impeding the rebirth of true religious renaissance. I think probably many of you share that view, and it's in studying this topic about free will, I have come to the conclusion that free will is the Achilles heel of materialism, I think I had a different. This dire view here comes from a book called The Illusion of Immortality from Corliss Lamont. I think his great nephew ran for the Senate in Connecticut a few years ago. It's a very dire book. So libertarian free will requires substance dualism. There's 2 forms of dualism. There's property dualism, which is monistic. One thing exists, and there's just properties. They're all physical, derived from physical things. And then there's substance dualism. We're all in here pretty much substance dualism. We believe in an immaterial mind and thought adjuster and so forth. So free will, if true, would require dualism. Dualism requires interactionism. Phil talked about the interface from an immaterial entity, agent, into the material world. It requires that the universe is not causally closed. So it can't be the case that there is no way to penetrate space and time to get at the mind of humanity and other life forms. It requires that libertarian free will requires that determinism is false and that materialism is false. And probably I have never heard any other theory that, maybe chaos theory, but if free will is true, it's probably the case that somehow this interaction that's required is related to quantum mechanics. This statement here, I think, is perhaps the most important statement in the book. It goes to the heart of why we were created. The affectionate dedication of the human will to the doing of the Father's will is man's choicest gift to God. In fact, such a consecration of creature will constitutes man's only possible gift of true value to the Paradise Father. But not only is it a way in which we can provide our only way of providing a gift to God, but it also is a responsibility to do so. So free will goes to the very heart of why we're here. We're called will creatures for a reason. What do neuroscientists and philosophers of mind currently think about free will? Well, here's a famous philosopher, he is a psychologist, Steven Pinker, you've probably heard of him. Wrote a book called Better Angels of Our Nature, which purports to show that it wasn't until secularism and the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution that man made progress. I've glanced through some of his books, and I think he's playing a game with the zero baseline with the 20th century in terms of the number of people killed. I don't really buy his argument. Here's what he has to say.
I don't believe there's such a thing as free will in the sense of a ghost in the machine, a spirit or soul that somehow reads the TV screen of the senses and pushes buttons and pulls levers of behavior. There's no sense that we can make of that. I think our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain.
Okay, there's no sense we can make of that. This is a renowned psychologist saying that. This typifies the view in academia, as far as I know. Oops. And Donald Hoffman here is a well-known cognitive scientist from the University of California, Irvine.
Then there are
Here's
also
what he has to say.
libertarians, and this is the third major view, that
That's us.
free will somehow rises above the plane of cause and effect of the physical world. And basically no self-respecting neuroscientist or philosopher takes this point of view. So it's just not. It's not among academics a credible view, partly because it's dualist.
Right.
So the theories of free will are determinists, compatibilists, and libertarians.
Okay. Stuart Hameroff, along with Sir Roger Penrose, came up with a theory of consciousness and free will. It's very unique. It requires, to rescue free will in a materialist framework, it requires the backward time phenomenon in quantum mechanics, the delayed choice experiment, which really is actually true. It's been demonstrated. But he came up with this theory of consciousness with Roger Penrose. And instead of, somebody mentioned the idea of the observer collapsing a quantum waveform. Well, he and Roger Penrose say that it's actually the collapse of the waveform that causes consciousness. So it's inside science, it's not outside of science. And so his theory, and that happens at the quantum level in these microtubules inside the neurons of the brain. So the current neuroscientist thinks that occurs up the synapses, large neurotransmitters. These microtubules within the neurons are much smaller scale, where they can be affected by quantum superposition.
The mainstream approach is that consciousness is epiphenomenal, and that we don't have free will. For example, if you and I...
What does it mean to be epiphenomenal?
After the fact, having no bearing, and just kind of along for the ride.
The foam on the wave.
The foam on the wave, the steam from the engine.
Yeah.
We are merely helpless spectators, as T.H. Huxley said. Now the reason...
And we'll talk about why he thinks that. So he came up with this theory with Roger Penrose. It's very detailed. It's not easy to follow, but it's very interesting. But what it tells you is, if he's thinking about consciousness way down here at the micro level, the microtubules, and the rest of neuroscience is thinking up here at the level of the neurotransmitters, obviously, there's obviously the folks who believe that it occurs at the neurotransmitter level haven't made the case, right? So there's nothing in neuroscience today that demonstrates that matter in motion can cause consciousness, intentionality, or thought. Well, intentionality really is thought. I mentioned the backward time phenomenon. I reference that in the paper. I'm not going to be able to talk about it in the presentation. So moving forward here, Galen Strawson is a very well-known philosopher. We're going to come back to him at the end of the presentation. He has a very insightful thing to say, and you'll get a glimpse of that in his very first comment here.
I would say that there's a fundamental sense in which free will is impossible. And it doesn't make any difference whether the world is determined or not. It's impossible either way. At the same time, I think we can't help believing we've got it. So it's perhaps the most dramatic, irresolvable clash in the whole of philosophy, or indeed the kind of problems that...
Right, and I've come to find out that in fact it is the most fundamental, irresolvable conflict in philosophy, with the exception of consciousness itself. Okay, here's John Searle. John Searle is a world-renowned philosopher, Berkeley, studied at Wisconsin. He's famous for his Chinese room rebuttal of the Turing test, which is a strong AI position. The idea is that if you can emulate perfectly to fool somebody that you're a conscious being without disclosing that you actually are, then you've passed this Turing test and you can demonstrate, or then automated artificial intelligence has demonstrated that they're conscious. Searle rebutted that with his Chinese room experiment. Here's what he has to say about free will.
Called the problem of free will, this persistent problem, what is free will, something of a scandal in philosophy. Why?
Well, we haven't made any progress. I can't see that we have made an advance in the past, let's say, 100 years, or even a couple of 100 years, reasons. The reason for believing that we have free will is we experience it every day. I mean, I decide to raise my arm, and it makes my arm go up. But if I hadn't decided, my arm wouldn't have gone up. It was up to me. I could have raised my left arm or raised neither arm. We have the experience of conscious, rational decision-making, and we have the experience that the decisions were not themselves forced by antecedently sufficient causal conditions. Okay, that's the reason that we think we have free will.
Okay.
But on the other side, you've got an overwhelming amount of evidence that everything that happens has an explanation in terms of causally sufficient conditions. As far as we know, human behavior is part of the natural world, and it looks like it ought to be explained in terms of causally sufficient conditions. But if that's true, that everything has causally sufficient conditions, that we're completely at the mercy of causal forces, then free will is an illusion. So we have two inconsistent views: the experience of free will, which is the condition of free will, and the general knowledge about how the world works gives us the condition of determinism.
And they are absolutely incompatible.
Yes, not only incompatible, but it's hard to see how we could give up on either of them.
Okay, there's a flaw in his logic. We're going to return to that when he said we have overwhelming evidence that we're part of the physical world. And he returns to that. I'll return to that point, and at that time, I'll explain why I think his logic is flawed.
I should tell you, most philosophers think...
I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this point. What he's going to say is there's a field of study, a school of thought called compatibilism, which seeks to salvage free will, okay? But it's really not free will. It's they just essentially redefine free will. Now, Searle does not buy into compatibilism. He calls it a cop-out. Says it just evades the problem. I agree with that. When you listen to a compatibilist like this gentleman here, Daniel Dennett, he's one of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. He's a little old now. I think he's riding off on one of those horses into the sunset, but nevertheless, he's had a big impact on the thinking of people. He wrote Consciousness Explained, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. It's a long tape, and he's essentially playing a little kind of three-card Monte game with words such as avoiding, unavoidable, and determined. He's not denying determinism. He is a materialist. He's saying determinism is true. But what he's saying is evolution has programmed into the mind of humanity some computational processes that allow them to algorithmically, programmatically, do things that would avoid, for example, being hit by a brick. That's not free will at all. That is decision making. It's an algorithm. An algorithm is deterministic. When we think of decisions and free will, it's the opposite of that. It's creative. The other flaw in his logic is that he thinks that evolution has this ability to generalize specific cases. Evolution, if it can do anything at all, if it's programming a person through natural selection and mutation to do something, it's for the specific benefit at that time under those precise conditions. It can't look at that. It can't look at that case and go, oh, okay, well, you know what? I'm gonna make this widget here in your brain that's gonna, anytime something similar to that happens, I'm gonna allow you to duck from, if it's not a falling boulder, it'll be a brick a century from now. I think he's confused. I think you should take a class in computer science. Computer scientists do, in fact, program things like that in, facial recognition, all kinds of things that have foresight, that can generalize a specific case. That's because humans programmed them using the concept of the variable. But evolution doesn't have that at its disposal. So he's just supposedly a great philosopher, but I think he's really missed something. He needs to go back and think about that a little more deeply.
So we have to make...
No, we don't. Sam Harris, you probably heard him. He's another member of the there you go, Four Horsemen of the New Atheist Movement. His claim is, of course, that free will is an illusion. He wrote a book called Free Will. And he makes 2 points, which I'll get to in a moment. But what he's saying here in this slide, I'm sharing with you, is that free will is illusion. So either we're determined by the forces of nature, by antecedent cause, as John Searle was referencing, or because of quantum mechanics or chaos theory, our actions are chance, based on chance. Either way, we're not responsible for them. So what he's saying is that we can't be held responsible for anything. And this, in my opinion, is why over the years in Western civilization, this is nothing new, by the way. This goes all the way back to the 19th century. People believed that everything was determined. In fact, more so then because of quantum mechanics now, that free will was an illusion, everything was determined. And I think that it's one of the reasons that it's percolated through civilization that you really can't, to excuse aberrant behavior, okay? And you see that in all forms. The diseasing of America, of the West, and just reluctance to punish crime. So the claims that moral responsibility is not possible without libertarian free will is an illusion. I've talked about that. Let's move on. Here again is John Searle. Now here it gets to Phil, this is your point here about quantum mechanics. It's tempting, indeed irresistible, to think that the explanation of conscious experience of free will must be a manifestation of quantum indeterminacy at the level of consciousness, rational decision making. However, if quantum indeterminism amounts to randomness, then it's of no use. Okay? This gentleman here, Richard Mueller, anybody heard of him? He's from Berkeley. You have. He has become my favorite physicist. You'll see why. Did you read his book?
I haven't. I've got it.
Okay, he's on Quora, all over Quora, right? He says that philosophers' key assumption that the past completely determines the future is not supported in modern physics. Their arguments that free will does not exist were based on false premise of determinism, pre-quantum mechanics. We cannot conclude that free will exists, but we can conclude that nothing in science rules it out. Why do neuroscientists and philosophers of mind believe free will is an illusion? Well, you can't get into this topic very long before you encounter the name of Benjamin Libet. Benjamin Libet, in the late 70s and early 80s, conducted a variety of very interesting experiments. And here's what he found. Let me set this up here. Well, my animation is somehow broken. That's interesting. There's something over here that's supposed to be here. I'm not sure what happened. Okay, so I'll just explain. What he did was he put electrodes on the brain to monitor activity in the brain. He told people to watch a fast-moving clock. He wired up their wrists so they could sense when they're flexing their wrist. He said, okay, flex your wrist whenever you want. Don't pre-plan it, just whenever you want. And when you decide to do that, tell me where the hand was on the clock. And so they watch and flex their wrist. What he found was that there's a readiness potential before the person thinks they decided to flex their wrist, about 300 milliseconds before that. And then the wrist flexed about 200 milliseconds after that. And that has been used by many people, although not Libet himself, to claim that free will is an illusion because your brain has already decided for you. Libet also conducted another kind of experiment, and this is discussed by Stuart Hameroff. This is very interesting.
Is that if you and I are talking back and forth, and you ask me a question, I answer right away. If you analyze the activity in my brain for what you said, it happens after I've responded. So the answer in mainstream neuroscience is that I answer reflexively, non-consciously, and have an after-the-fact illusion of being in conscious control when I said it. The same thing.
Okay, so that in fact, this quote here, this study, this is just one of many studies that show that. When we're talking, not always, but when you're talking with somebody, as long as your response is something that is not really extremely creative, maybe it's just something, it does occur. So your brain, when someone's talking to you, you recognize about 400 milliseconds after the sound hits your ears. There's a activity in your brain that indicates a reception of these words. But you've already started to respond at 200 milliseconds. A fifth of a second before, your brain seems to have responded to the person's voice. Now, interestingly though, what Hameroff says, and again there's a piece of animation missing here, this is getting me a little nervous. What he says is that there's no, okay, so he's saying, and the studies will show, that there's brain activity, evoked potential when somebody's talking to you, but you've already responded. But Hameroff says there's no indication of the brain activity related to the response. And so that's a big mystery, but people never really mention that. Oh, there it is. Okay. This is strange. Okay. Sam Harris. Now this gets to a key point about free will that he touches on. He first opens up his discussion, he's referencing the Libet experiments, and then he goes into his real reason why he thinks free will is an illusion.
But the truth is, I think actually too much has been made of this research. The truth is, even if there were no time lag, even if a conscious intention were truly simultaneous with its neurophysiological underpinnings, there would still be no room for free will. You still wouldn't know why it is you do what you do. The thing to notice about this is that you, as a conscious witness of your inner life, are not making these decisions. You can only witness these decisions. So if you pay attention to how thoughts and intentions arise, and how decisions get made moment to moment, I think you can see that there's no evidence for free will. That actually our experience in life is compatible with the truth of determinism.
This guy gets a lot of hits on YouTube. People listen to him. This is nonsense. What I will say is he's part right. He's partly correct. We'll get back to that point near the end of the presentation as to why he's not completely correct and in essence totally wrong. Okay. Is the evidence against libertarian free will compelling? This interview with Peter Hacker, he's a philosopher of mind, talking about the Libet experiments.
Being wrong. But let's go into the very famous.
He makes a misstatement about the Libet
being
experiments.
That someone has to do a test of whatever kind. It's been repeated many times. And even before someone decides, well, I push the red button or the green button, the hand already moves. So you haven't decided yet, nothing happened in the brain, so to speak, and the hand already moves. So many neuroscientists say your body already shows the decision before your mind is even involved.
It also presupposes that every voluntary movement of mine is preceded by an act of will or an act of decision, and that's just false, as I tried to explain at the moment. I am, after all, talking perfectly voluntarily to you at the moment, but my speech is not preceded by hundreds of individual acts of will. So there's a misunderstanding about what exactly voluntary action is. And it's only because of that misunderstanding that they can think that they have adequate data to show that the brain decides and later on lets you know that a decision has been made.
So we're getting closer to eroding into this idea that, that in order for free will to be true, it has to be a direct conscious experience. That is not the case, and there's some more insightful comments coming up on that. This is Jordan Peterson. If you haven't heard of him, you're maybe need to watch YouTube more. Very interesting, his comment. It's a little bit long, but it's very important. And this is Bob Sloan. You're here, right? Yeah, this is for you.
If I take my arm and I go like this, see, I'll do that again. Now, you see there's a movement like that, and then my hands stop just before my other hand. Now, it takes a certain amount of time for the neural messages to go from my brain to my arm and back. And the time it takes my hand to go like this and stop is actually shorter than the time it takes a message to get to my brain and back. So what that means is that when I plan this movement, which is called a ballistic movement, I've actually organized the neurological and muscular sequences that enable that action before it's implemented. I set all that up, and then it's released, and the whole thing cascades. And so once the action has been released, let's say, then I don't really have any free will because I can't stop it. Here's another way of thinking about it. Like we know, for example, that people who are expert at playing the piano look ahead of where they're playing. And they're doing the same thing. They're watching the notes, they're seeing where they're going. And then they're disinhibiting the automated structures that enable them to play what they've practiced so thoroughly. They're disinhibiting those structures. And then they go automatically. If you get someone to do something like lift their finger, and you scan their brains using a variety of techniques while they're doing that, what you'll see is that there's an action potential that and you ask them to voluntarily move their fingers, so they're doing it, let's say, by free choice. There's an action potential that you can read off the brain that occurs before the person either moves their finger or, let's say, decides to move their finger. And that occurs quite a bit before the feeling of voluntarism or that voluntary act. And so that's been read by Benjamin Libet, who did the experiments, as indication that even the feeling of voluntary choice is determined. But I don't think that that's a very useful way of addressing the issue, because the issue of when you lift your finger up, again, is it requires pre-programming to disinhibit. Like, you know how to do this, right? You don't have to learn to do that. So you have a little automated circuit that does this sort of thing. All these finger movements and everything, you can see babies practicing them.
Yeah, so again, the mind brain has this wonderful facility that allows us to multitask. We don't have to think about doing all these different things. We just go ahead and can focus on something, and unconsciously, but not non-volitionally, we go and do these things, right? You don't have to think about every note you hit, right? Yeah. So going back to the Libet experiments, and I did mention this, if you're focusing on the clock, Peterson just said there's a circuit in there that allows you to do this wrist flip or move your finger up or press a button, whatever it is. Well, you're really focusing on the clock. So you're multitasking, but you're kind of just giving, you're kind of unconsciously flexing your wrist. So it's not surprising at all that you would see this delay, this readiness potential before you perceive that you've made a decision, because it's really unconscious. You're focusing on the clock. You want to make sure you get the point on the clock correct. Okay, this gentleman, William Lane Craig, is, if I had to pick one person in the entire world who is fighting the battle in the trenches with the atheists and doing a fine job, it's William Lane Craig. He has debated all the prominent atheists in the world, except Richard Dawkins refused to show up. Christopher Hitchens, Sean Carroll, Sam Harris. And Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens said that he's the one philosopher that puts the fear of God into us in the debate. He knows his stuff. Here's his comment on the Libet experiment.
Where he asked patients to press a button, and what he discovered is that the neural signals in the brain to move the hand to press the button actually occurred a fraction of a second before the agent was aware of making the choice to push the button. And some, although not Libet himself, but some others,
he's correct about that.
This is evidence against free will, that it was the motor functions in the brain that caused the hand to push the button, and this was actually prior to the conscious decision. But as some other philosophers have pointed out, because of the finite velocity at which neural signals travel through the brain along our nerves, it's no surprise at all that there would be a time delay between the decision of the soul or the mind to do something and the consciousness in mental awareness of that state.
Okay, interesting. So there's a different sort of architecture that people intuitively believe about free will. He's saying that something up here happens. A decision is made by the mind, or what he calls the soul. Okay? It traverses through the brain, and it gets to our conscious awareness. And this is this quote was found in one of the other, your paper, right? You mentioned this quote here. This is the only quote I could find about sort of I could bring into this particular slide about the architecture of how the mind-brain interacts. So back to Benjamin Libet. So what did Libet say? Everybody's going around saying, oh, Libet showed that there's no free will. Libet did this, Libet did that. What does Libet say? The existence of the veto potential is not in doubt. I see what happened. I didn't have the most recent version on this thumb drive. The existence of the veto possibility is not in doubt. So what he's saying is, between here and here, you can veto. He asked his subjects to say, okay, watch the clock. You're going to flex your wrist, and then make a decision to flex the wrist, and then right away, abort that. And so what he found is you did see the readiness potential, but the wrist never flexed. So what he's saying is here is you could veto the automated response of flexing your wrist. So he's saying that free will is this ability to veto. So now you have William Lane Craig's talking up here about the decision of the mind and the soul, free will, going through the brain, and Libet is saying there's another aspect of free will, this ability to embrace or veto a particular thought. I know what I did. I copied the wrong slide. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to explain what this gentleman's saying here. He's a theologian, and what he is saying is that, you know what, we all experience, we really feel we have free will. We live as though we have free will. It's going to take a lot more than a theory of determinism, to demonstrate to me that we don't have free will.
The purpose of
Okay. We talked about the fine-tuning, in the context of talking about the fine-tuning. We talked about this idea of qualitative versus quantitative reasons for disbelieving materialism. The many worlds is a way of negating quantitatively the idea of fine-tuning, because you're just saying, hey, there's an infinite number of universes, it's bound to happen. It's bound to happen if it's possible. But is it even possible for particles in motion to cause consciousness or intentionality, which are internal thoughts? Renowned quantum physicist Henry Stape, worked with Schrodinger, I believe, has this to say. I don't like the way he words things, but there is nothing in the classical conception of physically described matter that could cause even a complex, classically conceived, high-level system, even the most complicated system imaginable, to embellish itself, to endow itself with an experience of knowing or feeling. Such a causal capacity is not in the inventory of properties assigned to physically described systems, the standard model of classical physics. The physically described aspects of systems as conceived of in classical physics have been stripped of any necessary causal connection to knowings or feelings. The physical aspects are both causally and conceptually complete. But it's an assertion. You can't prove that. I'm looking for a way to demonstrate that. I have not been able to come up with a way to demonstrate that that's absolutely the case. Intuitively, it sure seems like the case. How could it be that just particles moving around through space could cause consciousness? What is it? Is it the speed they're going, the direction, the combination of them? It has never made any sense to me, but everybody believes it in academia, virtually.
All of them are physicalists.
For example,
what they think is that our brains cause our conscious experiences and our behavior. But they have no idea how. And in other talks I've discussed this issue, the hard problem of consciousness. There's no theory that a scientist has ever come up with that explains how neural activity could cause a single conscious experience, like the taste of chocolate. No one's been able to do it. Every time a theory tries to start with neural activity and give you the taste of chocolate, at the moment the chocolate appears, it's really like a rabbit popping out of the hat. No explanation.
Right, so that's the hard problem of consciousness. So at least he's being honest. He's a materialist, and he's trying to figure out a way to how consciousness works within the context of starting from quantum mechanics, building up. The subject of this section is, what is the evidence in favor of the existence of libertarian free will? Well, the intractability of the immateriality of mind would certainly qualify as that. And that's why I say, now this, I copied the wrong, okay. Jeffrey Schwartz, I'm just going to talk about what he's saying here. In the interest of time, it's kind of a long quote. He is one of the developers of neuroplasticity. Essentially what he's saying is, we can do things with our attention. We can focus our attention to change our brain and get rid of bad habits. He talks about this area of the brain called the striatum, that when Jordan Peterson was talking about raising the finger and so forth, automated motions, those are actually built into the striatum, and they actually run, unless your attention is superseding that, it just runs your cortex, is what he's saying. And he goes on to say that, imagine if you had to think about every move. He talked about getting out of the chair. If you had to, every move you made, you had to actually consciously think about it. It just wouldn't be possible to do anything else, right? So that goes back to this multitasking capability of the mind-brain. My comment here is, it takes a little bit of explaining to do. The idea is that, so neuroplasticity is top-down causation. Remember, Stuart Hameroff said that the current view is epiphenomenalism. It's one way. It's from the brain up to our consciousness. Well, this neuroplasticity is top down, right? You have your mind and your intent to do something, and you say, okay, I'm going to do this, and it changes your brain. It causes you to act differently. That's top down. It would take an awful lot of philosophic mumbo jumbo to try to reconcile that with materialism. And I have some comments in the paper about that.
You can do things with your...
Okay, is free will illusion? Now I said, remember at the outset, there are certain conditions that had to be met in order for libertarian free will to be true. Determinism has to be false. Interactionism has to be true. But for interactionism to be true, interaction between a mind and a brain, it can't be the case that the universe is causally closed. But materialists believe that the universe is causally closed. Is the universe causally closed? Here is John Searle. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about what he's saying. His claim is that no one has ever given a coherent statement of the relationship between the mental and the physical, if they're two distinct realms, ontological realms, existing. How could something outside the system affect something within the system? No dualist has ever been able to give an account of how the brain can affect the mind or how the mind can affect the brain, according to John Searle. Now, here's the problem with that. It's an issue of category of causes, okay? In the material world, scientists understand the idea of causation, necessary causes, deterministic causes. They know the laws of physics, right? It's an unfair burden to say to a dualist, hey, you've got to tell me how your creator did this. How are we supposed to know? You know, most of these people can't even figure out how to put a play crib together. And now they're saying, hey, you've got to tell me how God did it. And if you can't, forget about it. It's not worth thinking about. So I think this is just an example of the stridency of materialism and sort of the blindness of materialism. They're so sure that only the material world exists that they can't even think straight about an alternative such as dualism. His category of cause is very different from mine. I freely admit I can't know. It's impossible for me to know how divine interaction works with the physical brain. I can take a guess. Yeah. So Daniel Dennett, again, wrote Consciousness Explained, and his claim is, hey, you dualists, no physical energy or mass is associated with the signals from an immaterial mind to the brain. How then do they make a difference to what happens in the brain? How can a non-physical thing affect a physical thing? They must affect the mind if you can have an influence on the body. This confrontation between quite standard physics, Newtonian physics, not quantum mechanics, and dualism is widely regarded as the inescapable and fatal flaw of dualism. To which Henry Stape says, no, because of quantum indeterminacy. There's a loophole in Dennett's argument. No mass or energy is required to determine which of the set of possible states a quantum wave function will collapse upon observation. But there's another problem with interactionism. It's not just that you can't detect the energy, okay? And Stape says, no, that's not true. There's another problem. Physicists have assured neuroscientists for years that the brain is too wet and warm to have quantum effects. Stuart Hameroff reports that has been disproven. It's now known through a variety of experiments going back at least 10 years that, and he talks about quantum spin and benzene rings, organic chemistry, they do exhibit quantum superposition. So the idea that quantum mechanical entanglement or superposition can't be involved in the brain should no longer be held to be true. But you'll have people like Dennett parroting that out for years and years to come, just as he's parroting this idea of standard physics quantum mechanics is about 100 years old. I'm not sure what, and he's heard all this before. He's heard people make these comments. I'm not sure why. And this is a fairly recent quote. Well, that's 20 years, anyways. Okay.
The picture of the world as mere mechanism has died. We've discovered first through quantum theory and then later on through chaos theory that there are intrinsic unpredictabilities present in physical process. Quantum theory, for example, says that you could not know whether a particular radioactive nucleus is going to decay in the next hour or not. You can give a probability, but you can't say for certain that it's going to happen. In other words, there is an intrinsic unpredictability. It isn't a question if we calculate a bit better or we measured a bit more exactly, we can eliminate that. If you take that realist point of view, you will incline, I think, to interpret unpredictabilities as not just unfortunate patches of ignorance, but as signs of an actual openness in the future. Not meaning that the future is a random lottery, but that there will be scope for other causal principles to act in bringing about the future.
I love this guy. That was a brilliant comment. And remember, going back to Searle, he said, but if quantum mechanics is random, it's of no use. And here Polkinghorne is saying that, hey, it could be scope for divine action, right? That's what we're talking about, interactionalism. Remember, free will requires interactionalism. You saw that Cyril did say that no dualist has ever come up with a way in which dualism could work. Well, here's Richard Mueller speculating in his book, Now the Physics of Time. I highly recommend reading it. Excellent book. Imagine, in addition of the physical world, there is a spirit world. This is a world in which the souls exist. It is a realm in which empathy can cooperate and affect decisions. Imagine that the spirit world can affect the quantum wave function of the real world. The physical world can likewise influence the spiritual one. In ordinary entanglement, that's a feature of quantum mechanics, between two particles in the physical world, detection of one of the entangled particles affects the wave function of the other particle, yet the entanglement is impossible to detect or measure if you are given physical access to only one particle. With both particles, you can see the correlation, but with only one, the behavior seems completely random. When I try to understand my own soul, for a renowned physicist to be saying these things, now he's retired, is really remarkable. I just give him all kinds of courage. And I was reading through some of the comments about his book, and people would say, oh, I was with him 100% until he started talking about the soul. So wave function from two worlds are entangled. That's his theory of interactionalism. Very interesting. Not sure if it's true. Again, how are we supposed to know? Right? Materialism and the design argument. Here's Richard Dawkins. This gentleman has done incalculable damage to human culture. He's a preeminent atheist in the world. He's written many books that are very influential: The Blind Watchmaker, The Selfish Gene, Climbing Mount Improbable, The God Delusion, River Out of Eden, goes on and on and on. And here's the thing. Materialism, I say this, he believes that Darwinism, natural selection, has defeated the design argument, and claims Christian theism is incompatible with Darwinism. This statement from the book of Romans: God's invisible hand, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, understood from what has been made. That was the view in the Middle Ages and so forth until Darwinism, really. I think I said earlier, maybe I didn't, that I said that free will I thought was the Achilles heel of materialism. But what's really supporting materialism is this idea that science has defeated the design argument for the existence of God. And it's neo-Darwinism that they point to. In fact, here...
For many years, for many centuries indeed, it seemed perfectly obvious that it couldn't possibly be a freak accident, because you only had to look at living creatures, the sort of magnificent diversity we see in this museum, and everything looks designed, and so it was clearly preposterous to suggest that it was due to any kind of freak accident. Darwin came along and showed that it's not actually a freak accident, but nor is it designed. There's a third way, which in the case of biology is evolution by natural selection, which produces a close imitation of something that is designed.
Okay. His atheism is founded almost entirely on the truth of neo-Darwinism, of natural selection. Natural selection has been pretty much disproven. Most people don't know it. This gentleman here, Dennis Noble, yeah, you know what? Shoot, okay. Let's see if I have this. Okay. I'm going to have to talk about it. This slide is something I added and I copied the wrong version of it. Dennis Noble put together this symposium or seminar, whatever you want to call it, gathering, the Royal Society in London. The Royal Society is the equivalent of the National Academy of Sciences. The goal of the gathering was to see how they can extend Darwinism to account for all the things that fly in the face of the theory. Embedded genes, nested genes, orphan genes, epigenetics, transgenerational epigenetics, the breaking of the Weismann barrier that was done by epigenetics, the breaking of the central dogma, the demise of junk DNA. All these things have just gone by the wayside. And so they're trying to salvage a materialist accounting of evolution. And that's what the gathering was about. He headed it up. He makes a statement. All the key assumptions of neo-Darwin have been disproven. He's not an intelligent design guy. He's a guy looking for a way to show that materialism is true, but he's looking for a different way to do it, other than neo-Darwin, the natural selection. Okay, I'm going to skip this particular one. Can we prove libertarian free will? Again, this is my favorite physicist now. Richard Miller comes to help. He has a very interesting comment in his book now, The Physics of Time. He says, is the existence of free will a hypothesis that can be falsified? At least we can consider whether a test could be done in principle. Here's my attempt. If humans always follow the laws of probability, which are related to entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, which I'll talk about briefly here, then free will does not exist. If humans regularly do highly improbable things that are not predicted based on external influences, then such behavior constitutes free will. Okay. That's in a section of his book called the Directed Entropy. Entropy is you could think of it as, it is probably the most fundamental principle in all reality. And it's related to the second law of thermodynamics in that if you have a bunch of particles in an area, and you confine them such that this category of particles is here and this one here, if you allow them to intermix, they're going to intermix kind of like this, in a variety of different ways. They're going to give the same thermodynamic properties. And there is many, many ways in which it can be organized to give what's called equilibrium in a high state of entropy, high state of disorder. Many more arrangements like that than like this, an ordered pair or an informational pair. To get a sense that now you can also apply entropy not to just molecules in a flask, but also to things like language. Michael Denton estimated that if you take a sequence of 100 English characters, only 1 in 10 to the 100th power will be meaningful. Everything else is gibberish. Everything else is entropy, high entropy. Very small set is meaningful, informational. No, a million monkeys typing The Age of the Universe will not produce the works of Shakespeare. In fact, it won't even produce one line of a Shakespeare sonnet. It's very easy to calculate that. This was Huxley that said this. There's 40 characters on a keyboard. It's 40 to the 100th power. 40 to the 100th power is way beyond the universal probability bound, the product of the number of particles in the universe times the number of Planck seconds, right? So that's a myth that you still hear. People still talk about these million monkeys. A deck of cards. When you open up a brand new deck of cards, it's ordered. It's an ordered sequence. I forgot how they do it, if it's by suit or by number, right? It might surprise you to know that if you shuffle the deck really well, what are the chances of getting back to that original configuration? It's 52 factorial. Your chances of getting that back are the same chances of going out in the Milky Way galaxy and grabbing one specific atom. Chances are you go to Las Vegas and look at the configuration of a shuffled deck that has never been seen before. Every one is unique, just given probabilities. That's how powerful the concept of entropy is, of probabilities, the probabilities of large numbers of things. So how does that relate to the mind and free will? Shucks. Okay. It relates in the following way. There's a graphic there. Okay, sorry. Well, what are the characteristics of thought? They're connected, right? You're driving home, you have a problem to think about, and each thought is connected, right? How could you think? How could you analyze? How could you ponder anything if that wasn't the case, right? It's also creative. Unless you're pulling out a memory, everything you're thinking is really, really creative. There's something new about it. And it's also continuous. Your thoughts, you ever notice there's no gaps in your thought unless you have a seizure? How is that possible? How is it possible for a material entity, the brain, to be that perfect, right? To be able to concatenate thoughts together. If you think about a thought, according to materialism, it has to be matter in motion. Well, if it's matter in motion, there's an awful lot of matter in the brain. Somehow, all that has to be organized, sequestered, and sequenced to create a thought, if that's even possible. I don't think it is. Neither does Henry Stape. So I shared that quote with him before. It's called the binding problem. What knows that these neuronal components are going to be used to create this creative thought? And how can you put together a creative thought anyways? If the mind is computational, which is what materialists believe, computation cannot create creativity. It can only redo things that it's done in the past. An algorithm is a plan. I suppose by accident you could have some minor improvement in something. If you took a book just by chance and you made a random change, you could change one word to another and it might give you new meaning and more correct meaning. But that is so unlikely because of this concept of entropy. Also, with the brain, there's no way that I have been able to figure out how the physical brain theory can ever escape the dreaded infinite regress problem. And here's what I mean by that. Every thought, if you're a materialist, is an arrangement of particles. Well, somehow those particles got arranged, each instant in time. So it had to have a cause. That cause had to be a brain component, a configuration of brains. How'd that happen? Well, that had to have a cause too. What about that one? That had to have a cause too. There's nothing to halt the regress. And philosophers of mind know this, I think they ignore it. Henry Stape, okay, this is going to bring, remember Sam Harris. Sam Harris did this little experiment where he said, think of a city. And from that, I showed you the clip. He made the conclusion that, your mind just throws things up at you. You don't have control over that. So there's no free will. I found in Henry Stape's book, which unfortunately I didn't put the name of it down there, a very interesting statement. This is one of the most interesting statements I've read. And I believe it's absolutely true. And it negates Sam Harris's theory as to why free will is an illusion. In psychology, the identity and form of a precept that enters into the stream of consciousness, your intentional thoughts, depends strongly on the intention of the probing mind. A person tends to experience what he or she is looking for, provided the potentiality for that experience is present. The observer does not create what is not there, but does participate in the extraction from the mass, which is the concept of entropy. There's a mass of potentialities, but your mind just pulls up and throws into your conscious awareness the very specific thing that you seem to be looking for. It extracts from the mass of potentialities individual items that have interest and meaning to the perceiving self. Now, that is absolutely true. When I'm trying to ponder something, think about something, it is absolutely the case that my mind delivers to me things related to the problem I'm trying to solve, what I'm trying to figure out. He's dead on there. And that negates what Sam Harris is saying about, just stuff comes in randomly. No, you do. It is a form of free will. You're asking your mind, okay, I want to think about this problem. And drip by drip, you get a bunch of insights related to that. Here's the sleeper in this. I didn't highlight it on purpose. Provided the potentiality for that experience exists. Have you ever noticed that your internal thoughts, your mind never gives you something you can't comprehend? Now, that's not the case when you're talking to somebody. Maybe you're not thinking, I can't figure out what Neil's talking about. But your own mind, will only give you things that you can comprehend. How is that possible? In a materialist framework, how is that possible? So the mind has this executive function. That's what I'm calling it up here. It knows what your values are. You get a thought adjuster. It's giving you what you genuinely want. It could be an urgent problem related to work. Maybe there's something wrong with you, in the family. Maybe something at work. Maybe something you're just pondering. But it's going to give you what you want. That is one aspect of free will. The other one, after it goes through your brain into your consciousness, is this veto phenomena that Benjamin Libet talked about. Another interesting thing that defies free will, and remember what Mueller said, if humans regularly do highly improbable things. I think that's highly improbable. If you're a materialist, and scientism is the view that only science is the only way to get to knowledge, okay? And that's getting to be a prevailing belief. Well, an extension of that, or something that falls naturally out of that, is that if science is that nature is transparent to human reason. Well, if nature is transparent to human reason, then that means that the human mind is capable of subsuming the complexity of the entire world, of the universe, modeling it. So, but interestingly, the capacity. So that's what the mind can do. The brain components, genes that code for the proteins that make the neurons, there's only about 20,000 of them, relatively small amount of information. Yet, this small amount of information results in an emergence of something, the mind, that can comprehend the entire universe. Maybe. An awful lot of information. If you compare the amount of capacity of knowledge, the sum total of all human knowledge, versus the bit of DNA that codes for the neurons, there's a vast gulf. And people say, I've talked about this with other people, and they've said, well, no. That's not valid, because look, you got the alphabet. There's only 26 characters, and you can make all this world of knowledge. I said, yes, but that's a human imparting intelligence into that to do that. What you're claiming as a materialist is that you have the brain, and it just magically, through deterministic causes, emerges to create this marvelous thing we call mind that can comprehend the universe. Okay, the fourth proof I have is this, final causes. Materialist philosophers only believe in two kinds of causes: contingent causes, which are quantum mechanics, randomness, and deterministic or necessary causes. The question is there another form of cause? We all believe there is. There's something called final causes, or agency. Einstein said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. What is if you're a materialist, what is the likelihood that the initial conditions of the Big Bang and the laws and the forces and the particles and all everything in the standard model would just happen to eventuate in its own understanding? You really have to be, that's a strain on credulity, I think. If you had to guess, given this is the only information you had, wouldn't you have to say that there's a direction, there's purpose in the universe, that it's not just an accident? Of all the ways in which matter could have been defined and formed, throwing in the quantum indeterminacies and randomness and so forth, how is it just so happens that it eventuates in a system, human beings, that could comprehend it? I don't have time to discuss this one here. This is very interesting from a book. If you really want to read about quantum mechanics, I recommend a book called The Quantum Enigma by Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner. They have a very interesting comment about the double slit experiment. There's a feature in the double slit experiment that the choice of the scientist, the researcher, is such that whichever way they decide, they can make a particle look like a particle or a wave. Okay. That's the complementarity of quantum mechanics. And they go on to say, a denial of freedom of choice requires our behavior to be programmed to correlate with the world external to our bodies, which is impossible. I need to investigate this more. I don't quite know what to do with it, but it was a very interesting book. Okay, I'm about to wrap up here. I'm going back to Galen Strawson. Very interesting. We talked about this in the last presentation. It's the biggest mystery I have related to spirituality that I think he's touching on. He's claiming that it doesn't matter if you believe in a soul or not, free will is impossible. Here's why.
So I would agree that if materialism explains the 100% the mind, and if materialism is a closed system, if you give me at that back part of the circle,
a soul,
some other element that is not caused by a prior condition.
Yeah, but then whichever way it goes, you've got to somehow have chosen it. But you can't choose it unless you already exist as a creature who has preferences. You can't, the two-word phrase, Latin phrase, you can't be causa sui, you can't be the cause of yourself. But you somehow have to get to be the cause of yourself to take fundamental, ultimate responsibility for yourself, and therefore for your actions that flow from the way you are.
Okay, so I one time had a conversation with somebody and said, how is it that some people survive and some people don't? They choose. Okay, but the ability to choose is a divine endowment. Why would somebody be given something by the divine which caused them to twist and render a mind evil? It can't be genetics, it can't be environment. You can't be held accountable for that. There's something, somehow you have to be the cause of yourself. That's, I think, what he's getting at. And he acknowledges, even with a soul, he says, I don't believe determinism is possible. There has to be some way. Ask yourself, have you ever been afraid that you'll someday wake up and decide, you know what, I don't want to do this God thing. I don't want to do the will of God. I don't know if anybody's thought about that, but you wonder why. What gets the ball rolling? Why do you want to be believing the God and thought of justice? Why do you want to do that? It's got to be something related to love, ultimately. I think that it has to be the case that personality and will is what enables us to be the cause of ourselves. Man's personality is eternal, but with regard to identity, a conditioned eternal reality. Having appeared in response to the Father's will, personality will attain deity destiny, but man must choose whether or not he will be present at the attainment of such destiny. When it is said that man has identity, it is recognized that he is in possession of a mind circuit which has been placed in subordination to the acts and choosing of the will of the human personality. So there's just obviously a mysterious quality about the will that allows us to be the cause of ourselves, to get back behind and make a genuine decision to follow the will of God or not. And that's all I have.